The silent observer. Isaac Marshall, a man who had earned his wealth through years of hard work, strategic thinking, and sharp business acumen, found himself on a commercial flight unlike any other he had ever experienced. The flight was Flight 437, a frequent route for Airstar Airlines, the company he had built from the ground up. But today, he wasn't the CEO. He wasn't the man surrounded by an entourage of assistants, executives, and bodyguards. Today, he was a regular passenger, anonymously traveling incognito. His goal? To experience firsthand what the everyday customer might encounter on a typical flight. Dressed in simple, comfortable clothes, dark jeans, a well-worn hoodie, and sneakers, Isaac blended in with the crowd. His goal was not only to assess the flight's service quality, but also to ensure that his company was truly living up to its promises of premium service. A man who had built his empire by understanding the importance of even the smallest details, Isaac was always seeking to improve. His reputation and commitment to excellence were crucial to him. But today, he would not be recognized by the other passengers, nor did he want to be. As he approached the check-in counter, he noticed the slight hesitation of the staff behind the counter. Their eyes briefly scanned him, perhaps wondering who this man was, why he was traveling alone without an entourage or special treatment. Isaac had long since grown accustomed to these looks, the silent judgments, and the assumption that someone dressed like him didn't belong in places meant for the rich and famous. He ignored their curiosity and proceeded with the check-in process. He slid his boarding pass across the counter, the woman behind the desk taking a moment to double-check the details. Isaac could tell she was trying to make sense of him. Her expression softened slightly when she confirmed his details, but there was still an undercurrent of confusion. He wasn't a celebrity or a famous executive, but he could feel the subtle shift in the way she spoke to him. Instead of the normal pleasantries, she was polite but distant. Isaac didn't mind. He had seen it all before. The unspoken judgments that followed him in both the business world and in everyday life. Once past security, Isaac made his way toward the gate. There were no VIP areas for him to relax in, no special lounges to visit. It was just a regular terminal, filled with travelers hurrying to their flights, all with their own stories and lives. He took a moment to observe the people around him. There were families, young professionals, tourists, and more. Isaac's presence in the crowd was just another face in the sea of passengers. He felt oddly liberated by it. For once, no one was staring at him. No one was asking for his autograph or his opinion on a business deal. He was just Isaac Marshall. No CEO, no billionaire, just a man flying to his destination. The air felt different in this part of the airport. There was a certain anonymity, a sense of freedom that came with blending into the crowd. He found his gate and took a seat in the waiting area. As he sat there, watching passengers come and go, he couldn't help but wonder what people thought of him. Did they suspect he was someone important? Did they care? He would never know. And frankly, he didn't mind. Eventually, the gate opened, and passengers began boarding. Isaac stood up and joined the line, quietly making his way onto the plane. The flight attendants greeted him with a warm smile, though there was a brief flicker of recognition in their eyes. But Isaac wasn't in the mood for conversation. He simply nodded, presenting his boarding pass as he made his way to his seat. It was a simple economy-class seat, nothing luxurious, but it was all he needed. He had purposely chosen a seat near the back of the plane, not because he was trying to hide, but because he wanted to observe everything. Isaac's business mind was always on, always searching for ways to improve, and this was an opportunity to understand what passengers really experienced on one of his planes. He took a seat by the window and began scanning the cabin. The flight crew were moving quickly, helping passengers store luggage, answering questions, and making sure everyone was settled in. Isaac noticed how the flight attendants moved with practiced ease, their professionalism evident in every gesture. But as he continued to observe, a slight unease began to build in the pit of his stomach. There was something about the way one of the flight attendants was behaving. something subtle, but present. She was smiling and polite, but her tone was off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was a distance in the way she spoke to certain passengers. Her attention seemed to falter when she approached some of them, especially those who were dressed in more casual or modest clothing. Isaac had seen enough to know what this might mean. The flight attendant, a young woman named Samantha, was walking down the aisle now, greeting passengers with a friendly smile. As she passed by Isaac's row, her eyes briefly met his. Isaac didn't flinch. He didn't need to. But there was something in her eyes, something that said she had already made a judgment about him. It was the way her eyes lingered just a moment too long. Isaac could sense the judgment, the assumption that he didn't belong here. He wasn't a celebrity, not the type of passenger who might warrant special attention. He was just another man sitting in economy class. The flight attendants were doing their job, ensuring everyone was seated and ready for takeoff. But Isaac's mind was elsewhere now. He had felt it before, the subtle undercurrent of discrimination. He had experienced it many times, both in the corporate world and in his personal life. It didn't matter how much money he had, how many companies he owned, or the work he had done to earn his place. There was still something about being a black man in a world where people weren't used to seeing men like him in positions of power. Isaac didn't dwell on it for long. He had come to this flight to observe, not to cause a scene. But as he settled in, he felt a growing sense of unease. The flight attendant was still moving down the aisle, and Isaac could see that her demeanor had shifted. There was a subtle change in her attitude. When she reached the aisle where Isaac sat, she hesitated for just a moment before asking if he needed anything. The words were polite, but the tone wasn't. Isaac smiled softly. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied. Samantha nodded curtly, her gaze briefly shifting away from him before she moved on to the next passenger. Isaac could feel the coldness in her interaction. It was a fleeting moment, but it stung. He understood it, though. He had spent enough time in the world of high society to know that people like Samantha, who had probably never encountered anyone like him in a position of power, had their own biases, whether they realized it or not. As the plane took off and the cabin settled into its routine, Isaac couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and today they were telling him that this flight wasn't going to be like any other. He didn't know exactly what would unfold, but he was ready to watch. He was ready to see how people would respond to someone like him. Someone who had built an empire from nothing, but who was still judged based on the color of his skin. And little did Isaac know, the events that would transpire next would change everything. The tension builds. As Flight 437 soared into the sky, the hum of the engines and the soft clinking of seatbelt signs switching off filled the cabin. Isaac Marshall, CEO of Airstar Airlines, settled back into his seat. The bustling sounds of passengers settling in, stowing away bags, and shifting in their seats were a far cry from the boardrooms and private offices he was used to. This was a different world, one where his wealth, status, and influence meant little. Here, he was just a man on a flight, and in some ways, it felt liberating. But that liberation was short-lived. From the corner of his eye, Isaac noticed Samantha, the flight attendant from earlier, glancing at him with a look that seemed to weigh more than the usual courtesy of a flight crew member. She had been polite at best, distant at worst, but there was something more than professionalism in her expression. It was a coldness, an almost palpable sense of discomfort that made Isaac feel, once again, that he didn't quite belong. He couldn't put his finger on it at first. After all, it was normal for employees in high-pressure jobs like hers to maintain some level of distance, especially when dealing with a busy flight. But as the plane ascended, and the initial excitement of takeoff settled into a quiet mid-flight routine, Isaac began to notice something disturbing. It wasn't just Samantha's coldness, it was how she seemed to treat other passengers too. The warmth of the crew's usual demeanor had disappeared when interacting with certain individuals, specifically those who were dressed more casually, or those who appeared more modest. Isaac didn't like to jump to conclusions, but he couldn't help but notice the subtle differences in how she interacted with passengers based on their appearance. The moment Samantha reached him again, as she began her rounds offering drinks and snacks, Isaac caught her eye for a split second. Her gaze flickered downward to his hands as if trying to judge whether his watch or his clothes were anything of note. When he looked up and met her eyes, the fleeting moment of discomfort between them was palpable. She didn't speak immediately, just paused as though weighing what to say, or perhaps wondering if he could tell that her mind was already made up. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" she asked, the words polite but cold. Isaac's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her face, trying to get a read on the person standing before him. There was something almost performative about her kindness, something that lacked the genuineness that he had grown to value in the people around him over the years. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied, keeping his voice neutral, but his mind racing. He had learned long ago to read people, and something about this woman's attitude set off his internal alarms. Samantha gave him a quick nod, her smile stiff. She moved on quickly to the next row of passengers, leaving Isaac with the unsettling feeling that she had just dismissed him without any true interaction. As the flight continued, Isaac couldn't help but keep an eye on her. He noticed that her behavior toward the other passengers seemed similarly detached, but there was something else. Something deeper in how she treated the few black passengers on board. It wasn't overt, but it was there. Isaac wasn't sure if he was being paranoid, but his intuition told him otherwise. It was the kind of subtle prejudice that people didn't always realize they were displaying, but Isaac had encountered it enough times to recognize it when it reared its head. The feeling of tension in the air didn't dissipate. In fact, it seemed to grow thicker as the flight progressed. Isaac could feel it building, an undercurrent of judgment, of discomfort, and even a certain level of disdain, though it was difficult to pinpoint exactly who was feeling it. Was it him? Was it Samantha? Was it the other passengers who might be silently observing the interactions unfolding before them? The subtle exchanges, the awkward silences, were beginning to wear on Isaac. He had faced obstacles in his life: racism, classism, and the general bias that often accompanied his rise to power. But this felt different. It felt personal. As the flight moved deeper into the journey, Isaac's unease began to grow. It wasn't just Samantha anymore. There were murmurs between passengers now, quiet conversations in hushed tones. Isaac couldn't quite make out the words, but he could sense the unease in the air, the same kind of discomfort that came from an unspoken tension. It was as though everyone had sensed it, the unacknowledged difference between Isaac and the other passengers. It was no longer just about Samantha and her behavior. It was about the atmosphere that had started to permeate the entire flight, an invisible weight that seemed to settle more heavily with every passing minute. The flight attendants were moving up and down the aisles, delivering drinks and snacks, but the conversations between them and the passengers were becoming more strained. Samantha, in particular, seemed to be avoiding certain passengers, those who appeared to be black or were dressed in more modest clothing. It was subtle, but it was there. Isaac could see it in the way she took a little longer to serve certain rows, the forced cheerfulness in her voice, and the look of discomfort that flashed in her eyes when she turned toward him again. The discomfort was becoming undeniable. Finally, it happened. Isaac was seated in the middle of the row, with a couple of empty seats beside him. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and most of the passengers were quietly enjoying their in-flight entertainment, reading, or simply staring out the windows. But the moment when the next incident occurred was like a bomb going off in an otherwise quiet cabin. Isaac had been flipping through a business magazine, trying to shake off the mounting discomfort he felt in the air, when he noticed a young woman sitting 2 rows ahead of him, a black woman with her child, struggling to fit her carry-on into the overhead compartment. She was doing her best, but the bag was clearly too large for the space. Samantha, who had just passed by Isaac's row moments earlier, came back into view. Isaac could see her eyes flicker toward the woman's struggle, but instead of offering assistance as she had done with others, Samantha simply walked past without acknowledging her. Isaac watched the scene unfold, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. There was something so painfully familiar about this moment. The woman struggled for a few more moments, clearly trying to squeeze her bag into the overhead compartment, but when it wouldn't fit, she let out a sigh and gave up. Isaac saw the moment her shoulders slumped in defeat, and it hit him harder than he expected. In that moment, the tension in the air snapped. It wasn't just about Samantha anymore. It was about what was happening in the cabin. The unspoken bias that had quietly built up among some of the crew and passengers. Isaac could feel the temperature of the room rising, and before he even realized what he was doing, he was out of his seat. He walked toward the woman, his footsteps purposefully quiet on the carpeted floor, until he was standing next to her. She looked up at him in surprise, but before she could say anything, Isaac leaned forward and offered his help. "Let me help you with that," he said softly, his voice reassuring. The woman blinked, clearly surprised, but nodded gratefully. Isaac, with his quiet confidence and calm demeanor, effortlessly helped lift the carry-on into the compartment. He turned to her with a soft smile. "There you go. Anything else I can do for you?" She was speechless for a moment before managing a quiet thank you. Isaac didn't give it another thought. He had simply done what anyone would do in that situation. But as he made his way back to his seat, he noticed something. Samantha had stopped dead in her tracks. The look on her face was one of disbelief, and Isaac could feel her eyes burning into his back. The tension in the air now felt more than just uncomfortable. It felt like something was about to give. And Isaac was bracing himself for the fallout. What had started as a simple observation was now turning into something much more complex, and the surprising twist that was about to unfold would make the flight attendant, Samantha, regret everything. The unraveling. As Isaac returned to his seat, the weight of the moment didn't escape him. There was something profound in the way he had helped the woman, but the consequences of that seemingly small act were still unfolding. When he glanced around the cabin, he saw the curious eyes of the other passengers watching, some subtly nodding in approval, while others seemed to avert their gaze in discomfort. He could feel the tension still hanging in the air, thickening with every passing moment. He sat back down, trying to refocus, but the unsettling feeling gnawing at him wouldn't subside. He had hoped his small act of kindness would make the cabin atmosphere lighter, that it would serve as a reminder of humanity in a space filled with strangers. But instead, it felt like a spark had ignited something deeper, something that had been building for much longer than he realized. Samantha, the flight attendant, had stopped dead in her tracks when Isaac helped the woman with the bag. He had seen it in her eyes, the disbelief, the resentment. She hadn't said anything, but the look on her face spoke volumes. It was as if she had been caught off guard by his gesture, not expecting it from a man like him. Isaac had already felt the undercurrent of tension between them, but now it was clear that she wasn't just uncomfortable with him. She was upset. Samantha disappeared into the galley, the small kitchen area at the front of the plane where the crew could rest between service rounds. Isaac tried to brush off the encounter, but he could feel her eyes lingering in his mind. He had seen the look of judgment before, but this was different. It wasn't just about her discomfort with him. Something about the way she had reacted felt like it had triggered something deeper inside her. Isaac didn't know what it was, but he was beginning to suspect that he wasn't the only one carrying old scars of prejudice. The rest of the flight seemed to drag on. Every time Isaac tried to distract himself, whether by reading or watching the in-flight entertainment, his mind kept returning to the situation. The flight attendants continued to move through the aisles, but the warmth in their interactions with passengers was now noticeably absent. Isaac had been paying close attention. When he looked up from his magazine, he caught sight of Samantha whispering something to one of the other attendants as they passed by his row. They didn't look at him, but the brief glance exchanged between them was enough to confirm what Isaac had suspected. A few rows behind, a few passengers started murmuring quietly among themselves. The cabin wasn't exactly silent, but now there was a discomforting undercurrent to the hum of conversation. Isaac couldn't tell exactly what they were saying, but he could feel the judgment and quiet tension hanging in the air. There was a ripple effect to his simple act of kindness, and now it seemed to have shifted the entire atmosphere of the flight. A moment that should have been an ordinary, quiet exchange had somehow become a flashpoint. Isaac knew he wasn't imagining things. He had been in this game long enough to know when something was off. His instincts had never steered him wrong before. And now he could feel it. Something was building, something big. The tension wasn't just between him and Samantha. It was something larger, more pervasive. It was the invisible walls that had been silently erected between the passengers, between the crew, and between the unspoken assumptions people carried with them. As the flight reached its midway point, things began to spiral. The flight attendants, who had been providing their usual services, now seemed to be moving more hastily, more disconnectedly, as though they were all on edge. Samantha, in particular, was moving through the aisles with a clipped, businesslike manner that felt out of place. She was no longer her usual self, no longer the warm, helpful person she had been when the flight began. Isaac noticed that her interactions with other passengers, especially those of color, had grown more distant. She wasn't rude, but the friendliness that she had offered at the start had vanished. Her smile was stiff, her tone formal, as though she were going through the motions rather than genuinely engaging with anyone. Isaac's eyes followed her as she moved down the aisle again, her eyes briefly meeting his as she passed. The look she gave him this time was even colder, more disapproving. The moment she reached a row of passengers ahead, Isaac saw her approach them with a noticeable hesitancy. She hesitated before offering drinks, her eyes flicking nervously over the passengers seated there, black passengers who were dressed in simple, modest clothing. Isaac's heart sank. He had seen this before. The subtle unease, the unspoken bias, and the way people with privilege often shifted their behavior when faced with those they perceived as different. It was a pattern, one Isaac had witnessed countless times in both the corporate world and in his personal life. People would treat him differently when they didn't know who he was, when they saw only the color of his skin, or the way he looked, or the assumptions they made about him based on those things. But here, on this plane, it wasn't just happening to him. It was happening to others too. And that realization, realizing how pervasive and insidious prejudice could be, hit him harder than he expected. Isaac's mind raced. He had spent years building his empire, working tirelessly to overcome the obstacles that had been placed in his path because of his race. But seeing what was unfolding now, seeing how the flight attendant's discomfort seemed to spread throughout the cabin, made him realize that even success couldn't shield him from the biases that existed in the world. It wasn't just about one person or one moment. It was a much larger issue. As the flight continued, Isaac couldn't help but feel the eyes of the other passengers on him. There was a quiet energy in the air now, and he couldn't tell if it was their judgment or his own growing discomfort, but the atmosphere had definitely shifted. People were whispering to each other, glancing at him and the flight attendants, watching the subtle shifts in body language and tone. It wasn't overt hostility, but it was palpable. He could feel the room closing in on him, each passing minute adding weight to the tension. Then, unexpectedly, the flight took another turn. As Isaac settled back in his seat, his mind still spinning, the plane hit a rough patch of turbulence. The jolt of the plane as it dipped and swayed was sudden and intense. It rattled the cabin, sending a ripple of anxiety through the passengers. The seatbelt sign flashed back on, and everyone instinctively reached for their belts. The flight attendants, who had been moving briskly, now hurried back to their stations. But in the chaos of the turbulence, Isaac caught a glimpse of Samantha again. This time, she was standing by the galley door, her eyes locked on him with an intensity that was hard to ignore. Her face was tight, her features pinched in a way that spoke volumes about the internal conflict she was experiencing. In that moment, Isaac realized something else. Samantha wasn't just uncomfortable with him. She was terrified. Terrified of the consequences of her own actions, terrified of what she had just witnessed. A simple moment of kindness that had thrown a wrench into her carefully constructed world of assumptions and biases. As the turbulence subsided and the cabin began to settle again, Isaac saw Samantha walk toward him, her steps measured. This time, there was no pretense in her approach. She didn't ask him if he needed anything. She didn't offer him drinks or snacks. Instead, she stood at the edge of his seat, her expression unreadable. I just wanted to apologize," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. Earlier. I don't know what came over me." Isaac was taken aback by the sincerity in her voice. He wasn't sure what to say at first. He had expected her to brush it off, to avoid the confrontation altogether. But here she was, standing before him, genuinely remorseful. "I understand," Isaac said softly. "It's okay." But it wasn't just okay. It was a pivotal moment. It was a moment where both of them could have easily turned away, let the moment pass, and continued with their lives as if nothing had happened. But instead, there was an unspoken understanding that this was a turning point. The tension that had filled the cabin wasn't just about one flight or one passenger. It was about something larger, something that was not easily resolved. And in that moment, Isaac realized that the flight, with all its discomfort and tension, had sparked something in Samantha, a realization that she could no longer ignore the prejudices she had carried with her. The flight was far from over, but Isaac knew one thing for sure: this incident would haunt both of them for a long time. And as he looked into Samantha's eyes, he realized that this moment, this awkward, uncomfortable exchange, had the power to change both their lives. A moment of reflection. As the flight settled into a calm routine after the turbulence, Isaac couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just occurred. Samantha's unexpected apology lingered in the air between them. She had caught him off guard with her sincerity, but it wasn't just the words she had spoken that had struck him. It was the vulnerability in her eyes, the way her voice had faltered when she realized the impact of her earlier actions. Isaac leaned back in his seat, allowing the soft hum of the engines to wash over him. The cabin was relatively quiet now, most passengers either lost in their own thoughts or engrossed in their personal entertainment. The atmosphere had shifted, no longer filled with the tension that had clouded the air earlier. It was as if everyone had collectively exhaled, though none of them fully understood the depth of what had transpired. Isaac's mind was still racing, processing the events of the past few hours. He had entered this flight with the intention of observing the crew and the passengers. He had hoped to experience the journey from the perspective of an everyday customer, someone who wasn't shielded by his title, his wealth, or his fame. It was an experiment, a self-imposed test of his company's service, but it had evolved into something far more personal. What he had witnessed during this flight wasn't just a reflection of the airline service. It was a reflection of something much deeper, something embedded in the hearts of people, the biases, the judgments, and the assumptions that shaped their interactions with one another. Isaac had spent much of his life fighting to prove himself. As a black man who had risen to the top of a predominantly white, male-dominated industry, he had faced countless challenges. He had been overlooked, underestimated, and underestimated again. But with every obstacle, he had grown stronger. He had learned to rise above it, to silence the doubt and the hatred that sometimes tried to follow him. He had built his empire on resilience, hard work, and a relentless drive to succeed. But today on this flight, he realized that despite all he had achieved, the world wasn't always going to see him as the man he had become. Sometimes they would still see him as the man they wanted him to be, the man they had already decided he was. Samantha's behavior had been a stark reminder of that. She had not known who he was when she first encountered him. To her, he was just another black man sitting in economy class, someone who didn't fit the mold of what she expected. He had been nothing more than an anonymous figure, a part of the background noise of the flight. But the moment he had acted out of kindness, the moment he had helped the woman with her carry-on, everything changed. In her eyes, Isaac had become something other than the man she had judged him to be. And that was when the discomfort surfaced. The tension she had carried with her for so long was laid bare. For all her training, for all her professionalism, she had been human in that moment. She had revealed her biases, and it had taken a simple act of decency to force her to confront them. Isaac had seen this before. He had seen it in boardrooms, in high-stakes meetings, and even in his personal life. People would look at him, assess him based on their preconceived notions, and then make their judgment. It was an exhausting, invisible battle that black men like him often fought, trying to prove their worth in a world that didn't always see them as equals. And the truth was, no amount of success, no amount of wealth, could shield them from that reality. But Samantha's reaction was different. Her apology had been a sign that something inside her had shifted, that she had realized something about herself that she could no longer ignore. Isaac wasn't sure if she fully understood what had happened, but he could sense that the moment had left an indelible mark on her. For the first time in a long while, someone had broken through the walls she had built around herself, forcing her to reckon with the uncomfortable truths she had never acknowledged. Isaac turned his attention to the woman and child he had helped earlier. She was seated quietly, her child now asleep on her lap. Isaac had been observing her closely since he helped her with the bag, and though she hadn't said much to him, he could see the quiet gratitude in her eyes whenever their gazes met. She had not asked for his help, nor had she expected it. But when Isaac had stepped in, she had accepted his gesture without hesitation, and in that moment, he had realized that perhaps it wasn't just about helping her with her luggage. It was about showing her, and everyone else in that cabin, that people could still be kind, even when the world didn't expect it. As the flight continued, Isaac found his mind drifting back to his company and the vision he had for Airstar Airlines. He had built Airstar from the ground up, and its success had been driven by his ability to push boundaries, to challenge the status quo, and to ensure that everyone, regardless of their background or social standing, had access to the same level of service. Airstar wasn't just an airline, it was a symbol of inclusivity, of equality, and of excellence. And as much as Isaac had focused on expanding the business, he now realized that there was still work to be done, not just within the confines of his company, but in the world outside it. Isaac knew that the biases he had encountered on this flight were not unique to Samantha or to Airstar. They were systemic, woven into the very fabric of society. It wasn't just about one person's actions, it was about the broader culture of inequality, the way people were taught to view others based on the color of their skin, their appearance, or their background. And if he was truly committed to making a difference, he couldn't just focus on growing his business. He had to challenge these assumptions, not just in the boardrooms or the front offices, but in everyday interactions, in the very spaces where people encountered each other. But before he could act on these realizations, Isaac knew that he had to understand the situation better. He needed to fully comprehend what had just happened, not just from his perspective, but from Samantha's as well. He needed to understand why she had reacted the way she did, why she had assumed he didn't belong, and how that assumption had affected the way she interacted with the other passengers. He couldn't change the world alone, but perhaps through dialogue, he could begin to plant the seeds of change. Isaac looked toward the front of the cabin, where Samantha was seated with the other flight attendants, preparing for the next round of service. He could sense the subtle tension still lingering in the air. She wasn't just avoiding him. She was avoiding the weight of what had transpired. He knew that she was struggling with herself, trying to reconcile her feelings of discomfort with the reality of what had happened. But Isaac understood that sometimes change didn't come in grand gestures or speeches. It came in small moments, in quiet reflections that slowly began to chip away at the walls people had built around their hearts. Isaac stood up from his seat, taking a deep breath. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew he had to say something. He wasn't going to let this moment pass by without trying to make a difference. He didn't know if Samantha would listen, or if it would even matter in the long run, but he knew that sometimes all it took was one conversation to begin the process of transformation. As he walked toward the galley, he could feel the weight of the decision hanging over him. This wasn't just about him confronting her. This was about challenging the very biases that had shaped the way she had treated him and the others on this flight. It was about showing her that change was possible, that even the smallest actions could break down the walls of prejudice. Isaac didn't have all the answers, but he knew that this moment, this quiet, fragile moment, had the power to spark something bigger, something that could change not only the way they saw each other, but the way they saw the world. And with that thought, Isaac approached Samantha, his heart steady but his mind racing. This conversation, this simple exchange, was the beginning of something far greater than either of them could have anticipated. The turning point. Isaac approached the galley with a calm that masked the storm brewing inside him. His heart was steady, but his thoughts raced. He wasn't entirely sure what he was going to say, but he knew he couldn't let this moment slip by. Too often, people ignored the discomfort and unease that lay beneath the surface, brushing it off as insignificant, as a part of life they couldn't change. But Isaac understood something that many didn't. Real change began when people confronted their biases, acknowledged their mistakes, and perhaps most importantly, listened. Samantha was at the counter, her back to him as she cleaned up after serving drinks. Her body language was stiff, her posture rigid, as though she was trying to maintain a barrier between herself and the world. Isaac could sense the tension in her, the way she was bracing herself, almost as if she were preparing for something unpleasant. He knew she had to be feeling the weight of their earlier encounter, the apology she had offered, and the emotional turbulence that had followed. He hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, unsure of how she would react to his approach. She had been distant, almost apologetic, but he could tell she was struggling with something deeper than just a simple interaction. Isaac wasn't the type to shy away from difficult conversations. He never had been. But this wasn't just about the flight, or even about Samantha. It was about something much bigger. The quiet but pervasive biases that influenced how people saw one another, the subtle judgments that colored every interaction, and the deep-seated assumptions that could shape someone's entire worldview without them even realizing it. Samantha turned around as she heard him approach. Her face was flushed, a telltale sign of her discomfort. There was a slight unease in her eyes as they met his, and for a moment, Isaac saw the vulnerability she had been hiding. He had seen it before, people who, when faced with their own shortcomings, tried to retreat into themselves, to protect their fragile egos. But this time, he wasn't going to let her retreat. He wasn't going to let her hide from the reality of what had just unfolded. "Can we talk for a moment?" Isaac asked, his voice soft but firm. Samantha hesitated, her eyes flicking around the galley as though searching for an escape route. But then she took a deep breath and nodded, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Of course," she said, her voice a mixture of reluctance and resignation. Isaac motioned toward a quiet corner of the galley, where they could have some privacy. Samantha followed him, her footsteps tentative, as though she were unsure of how to navigate this conversation. Isaac could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. This wasn't just a conversation between two people, it was a reflection of the larger societal issues that had shaped both of their lives. He had no illusions about the difficulty of the task ahead, but he also knew that this conversation could be the beginning of something profound. When they reached the corner, Isaac turned to face her. The distance between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. Samantha was avoiding his gaze now, her hands fidgeting nervously with the sleeve of her uniform. Isaac took a deep breath and began, his voice steady, but laced with an unspoken urgency. "Samantha," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something." Samantha looked up at him, her eyes wide, as though bracing for the confrontation she had feared. But Isaac's tone was not accusatory. He wasn't looking for blame. He wasn't looking to make her feel guilty. He was looking for understanding, for the kind of self-awareness that could lead to change. "When you saw me helping that woman earlier with her bag, what went through your mind?" Isaac asked, his voice calm but direct. Samantha's eyes flickered with a mixture of confusion and discomfort. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, unsure of how to respond. Isaac could see that she was struggling with the question, with the way it forced her to confront her own internal biases. I didn't know who you were," she admitted after a long pause, her voice low. "And I guess I assumed you were just another guy. Just a regular passenger." She hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I thought that." Isaac nodded slowly. "It's okay," he said. "I'm not upset, but I want you to understand something. It's not about me being a regular passenger. It's about the assumptions we all make about people based on how they look or what they wear. And I could see it in your eyes when you looked at me earlier. I could feel it. The discomfort, the judgment." Samantha's face flushed deeper, and she looked away, her lips pressed tightly together. Isaac could see that his words were hitting home, but there was something else in her expression now, a kind of quiet shame, as though she were coming to terms with something she hadn't fully understood before. I didn't mean to make you feel that way," she said softly. "I wasn't trying to judge you. It's just, I've never really thought about it that way." Isaac nodded again, understanding the difficulty of what she was grappling with. She wasn't a bad person. She was someone who, like so many others, had been shaped by the world around her. She had been taught to view people through a lens of stereotypes and biases, often without realizing the harm they caused. But now, in this moment, Samantha was beginning to see things differently. She was beginning to question the assumptions she had carried with her for so long. "It's not always easy to recognize our own biases," Isaac said gently. "We all carry them, whether we realize it or not. It's a part of how we've been conditioned to see the world. But the important thing is being willing to face them, to confront the discomfort, and to grow from it." Samantha's eyes met his then, a flicker of understanding passing between them. She was no longer avoiding him, no longer trying to hide from the truth. In that brief moment, there was a connection, a shared understanding that transcended the confines of their roles as passenger and flight attendant. It was a realization that they were both human, both shaped by the same forces, both capable of change. "I never thought about it like that," Samantha said, her voice tinged with regret. I never really considered how my actions might affect others. I never realized how much of it was about me, about what I was bringing to the table." Isaac smiled softly, his expression warm. "It's not easy," he said. "We all have our blind spots, but recognizing them is the first step toward doing better." For a moment, there was silence between them, a silence filled with reflection and introspection. Isaac could see that Samantha was processing everything he had said, taking it to heart. This conversation wasn't going to be the end of their journey, but it was a crucial turning point. They were both in uncharted territory now, both on the path to understanding, to growth, and to change. After a few moments, Samantha took a deep breath and nodded. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "Thank you for not making me feel worse than I already do." Isaac's smile widened slightly. "It's not about making you feel worse," he said. "It's about helping each other see the world more clearly. We're all capable of change." As he turned to walk back toward his seat, Isaac felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had entered this flight with the goal of observing, but what had unfolded in the past few hours had been far more transformative than he could have imagined. The simple, yet profound exchange he'd shared with Samantha was a reminder of the power of empathy, of the small moments of connection that could spark change in even the most difficult situations. But this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. As Isaac sat back in his seat and looked out the window, he knew that this conversation, this moment, was one of many that would unfold in his life. And though the road ahead was long and uncertain, he was more committed than ever to challenging the assumptions that divided people and to creating a world where kindness, understanding, and growth were the rule, not the exception. And with that, Isaac leaned back in his seat, content in the knowledge that, in that small corner of the sky, something had shifted. The ripple effect. The remainder of the flight passed by in a strange but peaceful silence, a stark contrast to the emotional storm that had churned just hours before. Isaac Marshall sat back in his seat, his thoughts no longer consumed by the tension he had felt earlier, but by the conversations, both internal and external, that had unfolded. Samantha's apology, her recognition of the biases she had unknowingly carried, and their subsequent exchange had been pivotal. But Isaac knew this was only one moment in a much larger story, a story about awareness, change, and the impact one person could have on others, even in the quietest of spaces. He glanced across the cabin, watching the passengers as they settled back into their routines. Some were asleep, others quietly reading or scrolling through their phones. But Isaac could sense that something had shifted, even if it wasn't immediately obvious to anyone else. The atmosphere felt different now. Lighter, perhaps. Less charged. It was as if the weight of unspoken assumptions had been slightly lifted, or at least made more visible. And in that moment, Isaac realized that what had happened in the galley, the conversation he had shared with Samantha, had planted a seed that would grow in ways neither of them could have anticipated. As the flight continued, Isaac couldn't help but reflect on the broader implications of his actions. His mind wandered to the many moments in his life when he had faced judgment, discrimination, and the subtle biases that had shaped his journey. He thought about his childhood, about the early days of his career when people questioned his abilities, doubted his worth, or simply ignored him because of his race. He had encountered this before, people who looked at him, saw a black man, and assumed they knew everything they needed to know about him. It had always been a battle, a quiet, invisible struggle to prove that he belonged, that he was more than the assumptions others placed on him. But now, as an accomplished businessman, Isaac realized that these moments weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a larger systemic issue, one that affected not only people like him but countless others who faced the same biases every day. He had worked tirelessly to rise above it, to break through the glass ceilings that others had tried to place above him. But as much as he had fought to carve out his place in the world, the fight didn't end with success. The true battle was about creating a world where people like him, people who didn't fit the mold, who were often dismissed because of how they looked, could walk through the door without having to fight at all. Isaac's thoughts were interrupted when the captain's voice came through the intercom, announcing the descent into their destination. The plane began its gradual descent, and the passengers around Isaac began to stir, fastening their seatbelts and preparing for landing. It was a ritual, a part of every flight, but today the hum of the plane felt different. It was quieter, more contemplative. There was a shared understanding in the air now, though it was difficult to put into words. Isaac could sense it, not just in the way the passengers behaved, but in the way they looked at one another, in the way the flight attendants moved through the cabin. Samantha appeared once more, making her final rounds before the plane touched down. As she passed Isaac's row, she gave him a brief but genuine smile. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. In that fleeting moment, Isaac saw that something had shifted, not just in their conversation, but in her. The coldness that had marked her earlier interactions had dissipated, replaced by something warmer, more authentic. He didn't know if she had fully processed everything that had happened, but he could tell that she was trying. She was, in her own way, beginning to break free from the biases that had shaped her world. Isaac had no illusions that this single conversation would instantly change the world. He knew better than that. Change was rarely immediate. It was a slow, often painful process, full of setbacks and moments of doubt. But it was also a process that required people to open their eyes, to listen, to confront the uncomfortable truths about themselves and the world around them. And for Isaac, that was enough. He didn't need immediate results. He just needed to know that a conversation had started, that a small spark had been lit, and that it might, in time, grow into something greater. As the plane touched down, and the passengers began to stand up, retrieving their belongings from the overhead compartments, Isaac felt a strange sense of peace. The journey had been longer than he had anticipated, not because of the flight itself, but because of the personal revelations that had unfolded along the way. He had come on this flight to observe, to evaluate the service his company provided, but in the end, he had experienced something much more profound. Isaac stood up and gathered his things, preparing to exit the plane. As he moved down the aisle, he couldn't help but notice the way the other passengers looked at him. There was still a certain hesitance, a lingering uncertainty, but there was also something else, a recognition. Perhaps they hadn't fully grasped the nuances of what had happened on the flight, but there was a quiet understanding in the air now, a sense that something had changed. It was subtle, but it was there. Isaac had disrupted the natural order of things, and though it had been uncomfortable, it had also been necessary. When he reached the door, he turned back to Samantha, who was standing by the exit, helping passengers as they made their way out of the plane. She caught his eye and smiled again, this time with a warmth that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just an apology anymore. It was an acknowledgement of him, of herself, and of the broader conversation that needed to continue. "Take care," Isaac said quietly, giving her a nod of acknowledgement. Samantha nodded back, her smile genuine now. "You too," she said. "Thank you for everything." Isaac didn't respond immediately. He simply smiled back at her, a smile that conveyed more than words could express. In that moment, he realized that the small act of kindness he had extended to that woman with the bag had set off a chain reaction, one that had rippled through the cabin and touched more lives than he had anticipated. And though it was only a small moment in the grand scheme of things, it was a moment that had the potential to ignite change, one conversation at a time. As Isaac stepped off the plane and into the terminal, he felt the weight of the journey he had just completed. It wasn't just the physical distance that had been covered. It was the emotional distance, the realization that even in a world filled with biases, people were capable of growth. They were capable of listening, of changing, and of challenging the assumptions that kept them apart. The ripples of this flight, of this small interaction, would continue to spread. Isaac knew that the conversation he had started with Samantha wouldn't end there. It would continue to unfold, and perhaps, one day, it would inspire others to confront their own biases and judgments. It was the beginning of something larger, something more significant than just a single moment. It was the beginning of a movement that could one day change the world.